Hi everyone, this is Tyler speaking. Thank you for tuning in. My talk today is called selfing. Selfing is another word for self-pollination, describing plants that can produce their own offspring. In many cases, this process isn't entirely autonomous. Wind or insects are needed to transmit pollen between the flowers of a plant. Selfing, like the self-made man, belies forms of dependency. Sometimes a flower cross-pollinates early in life, then turns to selfing later. Its usual pollinators leave the scene, or its anther and stigma grow closer with age, easing the transfer of pollen. These images show some self-pollinating plants, dried and pressed by a botanic garden in Belgium. Avena sativa, Solanaceae, Helianthus, Capsella rubellum. Fancy ways of saying oat, nightshade, sunflower, pink shepherd's purse. They aren't the best representation of selfing. I should be showing you pictures from their flowering prime, when they were young and dumb, stamens at the ready. I know this, but I like them, particularly the way certain plants were bent gracefully or forcefully to conform to the dimensions of the page. They've been excised from nature, deprived of the chance to live on through their progeny. Yet here in the pages of botanical record, they survive by another means. This is probably the right time to tell you that I'm not terribly interested in flowers. Or maybe it's more accurate to say that I'm not good at flowers. The only one I haven't killed is an orchid I bought at the Singapore airport, which is electroplated in gold. Even then, I worry that I'm not caring for it properly. What I am interested in are flowers as metaphors and mechanisms. I visited Singapore to research a particular convention where specialty orchid hybrids are named after visiting celebrities and heads of state. I developed a relationship with a grower and named one of its hybrids Richard Rowe, a moniker used in legal cases when someone doesn't want their identity revealed. Working against convention, my orchid wasn't tied to a specific person, but to a name that could be used by anybody. When first installed at NTUCCA Singapore, the flower looked great. This was its context, one would expect no less. But some showings in other countries were challenging, to say the least. The Beeler Gallery in Columbus, Ohio, brought in this amazing woman, Alana Odenweller, to tend to my flagging plant, which was suffering from fungal rot. The effort to keep the plant alive in a foreign and inhospitable climate became an artwork in its own right. I'm interested in selfing as a metaphor for these pandemic times. From one perspective, selfing can benefit a plant, allowing it to grow in places without insect and animal pollinators, like at high elevations and in areas of extreme cold. This frees the plant from having to invest in traits that attract pollinators, from flower size and longevity to nectar production. Yet selfing can be an evolutionary dead end, with none of the variation and adaptation that come from cross-pollination. Offspring are vulnerable to the vicissitudes of nature, a climatic event, a warming planet. This contradiction makes me think of life under Corona. We struggle to be resilient and self-reliant, without knowing how long we can last. I don't just mean this in terms of the individual, despite what the word selfing might suggest. A self-pollinator can be a person, a group, a project like home cooking, something that emerges during the pandemic, partly out of necessity, partly by desire, something reflecting our disenchantment with the status quo, now shown to be more precarious than ever, something revealing our drive to be accountable to the present moment, to assemble with urgency. Hopefully, these ties will hold. Two summers ago, I described Richard Road to my colleague David Getze, and he recommended that I read this book by Alison Sim. In its pages, I encountered selfing as a metaphor from a previous era, fin de siècle, Europe. Sim traces a, quote, poetics of vegetal creation, close quote, back to the German Romantics, who imagined the work of art growing, plant-like, in the mind of genius. Refashioned by queer artists and writers of the later 19th century, vegetal creation conjured fantasies of alternative reproduction, of hermaphroditic flowers, transient couplings of blossoms and insects, crossings and selfings. Social norms had no part in this place in nature, where the only stigmas were those waiting to be pollinated. If a single example could stand in for the whole, let it be the queer performer Loie Fuller. Here's a short film she made with the Pathé brothers. The tints approximate an effect from her stage performances, where rotating colored spotlights would irradiate her silk garments. I've tried to imagine the experience of these events, which could be an hour in length, to think of all the transformations that could be engendered in that time, to see this squat, unhandsome human take on the qualities of a butterfly, a tornado, a wave, and most emphatically a flower, always and forever becoming a flower, pollinating herself. According to Rhonda K. Gerlich, Fuller was extraordinarily famous when she died in 1925, but later generations have done a poor job of remembering. Gerlich offers a few explanations, foremost among them the fact that, quote, Fuller made a career of staging her own immateriality, dissolving into light projections on fabric, close quote. What lingered were the chains of transformations, more than the individual who begat them. Fuller was ahead of her time, a solo female artist fusing stage design, costuming, film, mechanics, choreography. She was a rare genus of self-pollinator, ill-equipped to survive on shifting cultural sands. Her line didn't die out, but waited until the world adapted to it. Darwin saw little value in selfing. Modification, change, and variation are the essence of life. Immutable species would decay and die out. They become, in Whitney Davis's words, quote, decadent species, close quote. I've been thinking about decadence over the past year. The word seems to come up whenever a society is on the verge of exhaustion, or when the talking heads say it is. Ross Douthat, a conservative New York Times columnist, published a book on the subject in February. Decadence, in his opinion, is a, quote, comfortable disease, close quote. We can live out seemingly meaningful lives within a climate of stagnation. What W. H. Auden wrote about the end of the Roman Empire may apply to our own. Quote, it managed to last for 4 centuries without creativity, warmth, or hope. Close quote. The Decadents, a late 19th century group of artists and writers, gave the word a twist, describing an individual who worshipped beauty and sensuality. Decadence as artistic vitality. This was too much for some critics of the age. Max Nordau thought it stemmed from perversion and mental illness. Others satirized the figure of the decadent, tall and thin, equipped with monocle and cane. His face, G.A. Savasco writes, quote, always looked weary, a weariness that followed his indulgence in every kind of vice imaginable. Close quote. There's no denying the wear and tear of the lifestyle. Many decadents trace the arc of hedonism to its terminal point, addiction, madness, an early grave. Still, the decadents were not blind in their pursuits. They fashioned their beliefs in distinction to prevailing norms. They were critical of decadence in its lesser forms. One example will suffice. Jean des Esseintes, the protagonist of J.K. Huysman's novel Against Nature. The last of an aristocratic family suffering through an era of bourgeois striving, des Esseintes is the personification of a dying species. To endure this fate, he decamps to a house in the countryside where he indulges his every sensualist fancy. Most relevant to our purposes, he assembles a number of flowers that look like fakes, quote, as if cloth, paper, porcelain, and metal had been lent by man to nature to create monstrosities. These are some of the ones mentioned in the novel. Caladiums, catelias, amorphophallus, that infamous plant that smells like a rotting corpse, hence the woman's need for a gas mask. Also a number of carnivorous plants, like Drosera and Nepenthes. Huysman's novel holds an ambivalent place in decadent literature, modeling a lifestyle utterly dedicated to aesthetics that is also symptomatic of social decline. Both meanings of the word decadent are linked, even indulged. Des Esseintes marvels over certain flowers that borrow the vivid tints of rotting flesh, the hidden splendors of gangrene skin. Close quote. I could go on, but I won't. The language becomes lurid, disgusting, stomach-churning. In the end, he reflects, quote, it all comes down to syphilis, close quote. I like contradictions, as you can probably tell. Selfing is a queer fantasy of reproduction. Selfing is an evolutionary dead end. Decadence is the height of aesthetic indulgence and a telltale sign of stagnation. At the beginning of the pandemic, I tried to find an artwork in these contradictions, in things that suggest both generation and decay, resilience and vulnerability to the forces at large. I returned to hand-drawn animation, which I had taught myself at the age of 21 to make this music video for Grizzly Bear. I'm a bit embarrassed to be sharing it with you. I like thinking about animation as a transmogrifier, to cite Calvin and Hobbes, a modest machine that creates wild transformations at the slow rate of one frame at a time. I wondered if it could be a means of selfing. Could I start with a drawing of a self-pollinating flower, then move frame by frame toward these contradictions? Could I make an animation that expressed generation and decay, that was alluring and lurid, off-putting and inviting? I began with an orchid called Paphiopedilum parisi. Here's what happened. Just as we get going, everything dissipates. A comically brief attempt. Along the way, there are some off-putting moments, like the hairy nutsack that appeared to my surprise. But the overall tone is inviting. A petal becoming a snake a duck, a duck a duck, a wave, then nothing. I hope Loie Fuller would approve. This is all to say that my animation didn't go as expected. That something did happen in the process of making it that helped me through lockdown, that inspired me to give this talk and to initiate a project with home cooking. I learned how to drift, making, tracing, and modulating, watching lines quiver between abstraction and mimesis, finding a foot in a stem, punctuation in a blossom, respite from the Zoom industrial complex. I enjoyed returning to this process, an invitation to drift while remaining in place. I don't know if you could call it self-pollination, but I was renewed through the art of slow transformations. Allies began emerging from the historical woodwork. These are pages from the Phytomnemonica, a 16th century book by Giambattista della Porta. Della Porta believed that he could determine the usefulness of plants based on the principle of mimesis. Thus, the hair-like structure of maidenhair ferns indicates their ability to prevent baldness. Plants with eye-like flowers could treat ocular disease. Remedies were even available for bites and stings. On this page, Della Porta connects the curved spike of a heliotrope to a scorpion's tail. These images remind me of what I like about animation. The plant that looks like the body, when applied to the body, can heal the body. From resemblance to incorporation through a chain of associations. I found these drawings in J.J. Granville's Les Fleurs Animées from 1830. The English translation is Flowers Personified, but for obvious reasons I prefer animated flowers. Here, the human and botanical worlds align. The rose, ever regal, enjoys the devotion of her beetle citizens. The aubepine or hawthorn tree recoils at the advance of pruning tools. My favorite is the Belle de Nuit. The flower opens in the early evening and closes in the morning, emitting a sweet fragrance throughout the night. This delightfully faggy flower is ready to party. One last reference, which has less to do with animation than with my love of faggy ephemera. I have to credit A Touch of Blossom for introducing me to Vic's Floral Guide, a mail-order seed catalog from the late 19th century. Of the many floral names for fags, pansy is perhaps the most enduring. Whether or not this was on the illustrator's mind, he turned a bunch of sailors into pansies. Superb pansies. Since I made my orchid animation, I've started a few others. working from these images as self-pollinators. They feel like interesting starting points, as the plants have been made as flat as drawings. Dried and preserved on the page, they're in need of literal reanimation. These newer animations are different than the first. Here's one. A dozen frames in, I stopped, then uploaded this fragment and another to a shared folder on Google Drive. Rather than finish them myself, I wanted to make them available to you. The fragments live as Photoshop files, comprising all the frames drawn to date. They can be downloaded by you and continued, then uploaded for future use. There's a spreadsheet where you can log what you've added. The link is in the copy below. Earlier in this talk, I said that, for me, a self-pollinator can be a person, a group, a project like home cooking. Perhaps a self-pollinator can also be an art of animation, where through our collective efforts, something new emerges. That may be a tad ambitious. So if nothing else, I hope the invitation to animate is also an opportunity to drift, providing respite and renewal in these challenging times. I'll be back in a month to share how the animations have grown and to talk about the history of collective animation. In the meantime, I hope you'll have a look at the folder and add some frames to the mix. Bye for now.